Regular Budget and Finance Committee for June 30th, 2014. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the Committee. I'm joined by Council members Bob Blumenfield, Mitchell Englander, and Paul Koretz, and we are ready to begin. We'll be taking public comment, general public comment, at the beginning of the meeting before our agenda items, but I see that we do not yet have any general public comment cards. Is there anybody wishing to offer comment on an item not on today's agenda? I see none, and so we'll go ahead and close general public comment. Members, I'd propose items 1, which is City Attorney's recommendation on settlement in Nelson versus City of Los Angeles, and item 4 as consent candidates, unless members have questions or comments or concerns. Any concerns about those, members? Okay, seeing none, those items will be deemed approved on consent. We have one closed session item, Farrell versus City of Los Angeles. And under normal circumstances, ladies and gentlemen, I would ask that the committee move to the other room, but unfortunately that other room is currently occupied. Hate to do this to you, but we're going to go into closed session for a brief discussion on item number 2. Are there any cards on item number 2? Seeing no cards, public comment on item number 2 is now closed. And if you're not here on item number 2, if I could ask you to just step out briefly, we'll try to get back as soon as we can. All right, thank you very much for your patience, ladies and gentlemen. We're back now in open session, and I think our last remaining item on the agenda is item number 3.
Item number 3 is a City Administrative Officer report in response to a motion from Koretz and Cedillo relative to a report released by the Fix LA Coalition entitled No Small Fees, Wastewater Systems Interest Rate Swap Deals and Related Matters.
All right, thank you. We've asked the Fix LA Coalition to be here with us to be able to present on this report in addition to the CAO's report, but given that Mr. Koretz's motion initiated this, I'd like to give Mr. Koretz the floor to kick things off for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In my view, it's the core fiduciary, moral, ethical, and operational interest of our city to ensure that we minimize the amount of taxpayer dollars that leave Los Angeles and maximize the amount of those dollars we have to fund services that our residents need. On an annual basis, the City of Los Angeles sends hundreds of millions of dollars to Wall Street banks for fees and services for investment management, debt management, and banking services. And the city's purpose for utilizing these services to help fund critical programs and services for our communities, including paying for construction of public facilities, police and fire stations, other neighborhood service facilities. The city also issues debt to finance public improvement projects, such as street and storm drain repairs via the use of wastewater bonds. And as I understand the situation, in 2006, the city refunded its wastewater bonds with synthetic fixed-rate bonds using complex interest rate swaps in order to hedge against rising interest rates. The assumption was that interest rates had hit historic lows and would never increase over time. And by entering into this swap deal, the city would never have to pay more than this synthetic interest rate, this synthetic fixed rate. However, interest rates decreased as they did in the fiscal crisis. The city was locked in for 22 years, preventing us from taking advantage of the historically low interest rates without having to pay a prohibitively high termination fee, which we did. LA, like many other municipalities, in my view, were lured into swap deals for periods of time unheard of in the private sector. My understanding is that in the private sector, swap deals typically are 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. And had we had that kind of a deal, we could have refinanced without a termination fee when interest rates were at historic lows. Swaps were promoted as a way to make investments safer for municipalities. However, instead, they spread confusion and convinced municipalities to take on more risk than they realized. Again, as I understand it, the City of Los Angeles would have to pay another $25 million in addition to over $26 million we've already paid in termination fees to get fully out of this bad deal. And I believe those $50 million would be much better spent investing in critical services that we all know we need for our communities. So from my point of view, today's hearing is to start the process of determining the best way of making sure that Wall Street banks aren't making excess profit from the taxpayers of Los Angeles. No one disputes that the reckless, unethical, and at times illegal actions by Wall Street banks led to the economic collapse in 2008. I think there's also universal agreement that the crash had a devastating impact on Los Angeles due to dramatically reduced revenues, which we still haven't really recovered from and which we're still struggling with here in the city. Now, information has emerged since the economic collapse in 2008 that clearly demonstrates that Wall Street banks manipulated interest rates, colluded on bidding, and generally misled investors, homeowners, and municipalities. And the City of LA has already filed multiple pieces of litigation against banks because of these types of actions. While it's unclear whether or not we have a legal cause of action with regard to the millions of dollars we're losing as a result of the interest rate swaps, I firmly believe that Bank of New York Mellon and Dexia can and should renegotiate those deals without charging taxpayers additional fees. The City of Los Angeles, together with its airport, its port, utilities, and pension funds, control $106 billion that flows through financial institutions. The city should use that financial and economic power to demand better deals from Wall Street so we can invest more in our local communities. And as I stated in the motion we're considering today, if New York Mellon and Dexia are unwilling to renegotiate or terminate this swap deal at no cost to the city, I'm calling on our council to consider terminating any current business with these banks and consider excluding New York Mellon and Dexia from all future business with the city.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Kretz. So I'd like to invite the CAO up first to start us off by perhaps giving an overview of the swap arrangements with Dexia and Mellon. Why were they entered into, and has there been any discussion with those entities to date about the potential for renegotiation?
Natalie Brill at the CAO's office. In 2006, looking at our wastewater program, we looked at various options how to refund our debt. And we looked at various different scenarios, and one of those scenarios was a swap variable rate debt for 3.344% interest for 6.1% of the LIBOR swap. And what that basically would have done is given us a fixed amount of debt service that we would pay every year for the remainder of the variable rate debt. One of the reasons that we went with this scenario is because it was in the best interest of the city at the time. Interest rates were rising at that time, and we looked at the best way to be able to fund our wastewater program. In 2008, unfortunately, the market fell apart. Nobody could have predicted that insurance companies would have been investing in mortgage-backed securities and would have basically crashed the financial market. At that time, we had 4 swaps. We had 2 with the convention center and 2 with wastewater. The 2 with convention centers were terminated because we were not able to get letters of credit. Nobody would give the city of Los Angeles a letter of credit to back its variable rate debt. Wastewater, however, was a different situation. Wastewater was a AA credit. It was a very good credit, so we were able to get letters of credit reinstated. Our bonds were not paying 12% anymore, and we were able to reinstate the swaps. In 2012, when we looked at refunding debt again, interest rates did hit a historic low. So we looked at the possibility of refunding part of the swap that made the least sense, which was the front end of the deal, which was the first 12 years of the variable rate debt. So we went ahead and refunded that debt, and we terminated half the swap. We still believe, based on analysis that was done by ourselves and by our financial advisor, that the swap should remain in place and that there's no need to terminate the swap. The amount of money that we're paying to swap providers is the same amount that we'd be paying for debt service. So it really is a swap for one type of issuance for another type of issuance. A lot of times we issue debt in a very high interest rate environment, and then we do everything we can to refund out of that debt, depending on what the market is like. The other point that I'd like to make is that at the time in 2004 and in 2006, when we looked at swaps, we wrote reports talking about the risks to the city and talk about what would happen if rates did go up. So it was very clear that there was a risk involved, but at the time, we did a competitive bond deal, a competitive swap, which meant that we went to the market, we put out an RFP, and we had providers come to us. Nobody came to us and tried to sell us a swap. We, in turn, went to the marketplace itself and looked to see what was out there. For the convention center swap, we had 8 providers that bid with the assistance of the city attorney's office. And the wastewater, I think we had 12, right? We had 12 providers that bid on, and they bid, and the ones that won were the ones that were at the lowest. And we did 2 in order to split the risk between the 2. We were in New York, as you know, last week selling our Tran. And at that time, we took advantage of the fact that these are also headquartered in New York. So we went to visit both of them. We wrote an additional report on June 27th discussing what we talked about. Dexia is a European bank that is owned by the taxpayers of France, Luxembourg, and Belgium. They are a bank that is not doing any new business. They are a bank that is basically winding down their debt portfolio. They're willing to talk to us, but at this point, we're just talking to them. Bank of New York is a different story. Bank of New York is a U.S. bank, and it is a bank that does business with the city of Los Angeles. So there are possibilities there of looking at Bank of New York and seeing what kind of termination payment we'd have to make to them. The contract that we did sign with the Bank of New York and with Dexia is a contract. In 2008 and in 2012, we did discuss with the city attorney's office the possibility of terminating those swaps and what the payment would be. But because it was a legal contract, it'd be difficult to terminate without the terms in that agreement. So with that, we looked not only at swaps in our report to you, but we also looked at the Fixed Coalition report and reported back to you on those issues that had to do with the CAO's debt portfolio. And the three places where we found that the report actually dealt with the debt issued by the CAO was in the bond issuance costs, where there was $12.9 billion in bond issuance cost reported in that report. 3.5 million of that is attributed to council-controlled debt. We had those costs because of the refundings that we did, and we did have a net savings of $142.8 million. So for the amount of money that we spent on bond costs, we actually saved $140 million over the life of the bonds. So we actually looked at both what we're spending on bond costs as well as the amount that we were saving because of those transactions. Out of the $18.9 million that was cited for remarketing fees and letters of credit fees, of that amount, $1 million is for marketing fees and $17.9 million is for letters of credit. We do have remarketing fees and we do have letters of credit. And the reason we have those is because right now interest rates are extremely low, and it makes sense for us financially to pay those type of fees. Altogether, when you look at MICLA and wastewater, maybe you're paying about 1% for debt. That's much less than going out on a fixed rate debt deal, which will cost you anywhere from 3 to 5%, depending on the market. The last area that I talked about before was the swap payments. And one of the things that I did want to clarify is that the reason that we did a swap in 2006, again in 2012, was because it was a better way for the city to spend its wastewater debt portfolio. So with that, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Okay, thank you. Members, questions for Ms. Moore before we go to the coalition? Yes, Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions, but hopefully they're pretty simple, straightforward, largely yes-no questions. First of all, as I understand the situation, if we had instead undertaken a fixed-rate loan, that we would have been well-positioned either way. If interest rates went up, we'd be well-positioned because we'd have a lower-rate loan than the current interest rates. If interest rates went down, we would refinance the debt as we've been doing in our other higher interest rate, fixed rate deals, and we'd save money there as we have by the many millions of dollars. So would we not have been in good shape no matter what had we done a fixed rate interest rate deal instead of a swap deal?
Well, if we would have done a fixed rate deal in 2006, we usually have a 10-year call, which means that we would not have been able to refund until 2016. So today I wouldn't probably be able to refund the fixed rate debt. I would have had to wait to 2016 in order to refund that debt. So it's unclear whether or not 2016 rates would still be low or not, low enough to be able to refund. Today, all the debt that we have up to this point in wastewater, we have refunded. That's why we did a refunding in 12 and in 2013, because those were the bonds that were due 10 years, which is the usual call date. So we were able to refund those. But if we would have done fixed rate in 2006, we would still be waiting 2 to 3 years to be able to refund that debt.
So do we not have any other process allowing us to get debt refunded sooner, and have we not undertaken those processes?
We do. We have what's called an advance refunding, which means that you put the money in escrow and you issue new debt, but because interest rates are so low, the amount of interest that you make on that money is not enough to pay the debt service. So the numbers just don't work out. We've tried that a couple times in our other debt programs, and we have been unable to do it because the whole point to refunding is to lower the amount of interest that you're paying. If you have to borrow for the interest to pay back the bonds that you refunded, it doesn't make sense to do the refunding.
Now, it seems like the riskier scenario is the swap scenario because you can't refinance your debt for the entire life of the bond, which is a very long 22 years. Did we know that we couldn't refinance under this swap deal without a hefty termination fee?
Yes, we did know that.
And was discussion and analysis provided to the council at the time?
Yes, the 2006 report does talk about the interest rate risk and the fact that if interest rates went up, if interest rates went down, we'd be paying more on the swap. This was disclosed in 2006.
Did it document that in detail? And
In the report, I believe it does.
Can you get those documents
Sure, we can pull out the council file.
Were we aware that in the private sector, swaps generally are very short-term vehicles, generally a year, 3 years, 5 years, and that 22 years would be virtually unheard of in the private sector?
Well, I don't know about the private sector swaps, but I do know in the public sector that our contemporaries that were doing swaps were doing them about the same time period that we were doing them.
And are you aware that virtually all of our contemporaries across the country have blasted these deals, which seem very similar to ours, basically for being money-losing ripoffs, and have sued to get that money back based on having been sold kind of a risky bill of goods that made sense for the providers, the banks, but not for the government entities? So
I can't really answer that because I haven't studied other people who have done other swaps.
So is there a reason why we're not looking at other cities, since by pretty large numbers other cities are going after the banks? And we, for the virtually identical deals, are saying that they were a great money-saving deal, and we actually have no justification for doing that.
I don't think I'm the appropriate person to be answering that question. I think that's a question for the city attorney's office. They would have to look at the documents and tell me that.
Have you asked them?
The city attorney's office? We had discussions with the city attorney's office in 2008 as well as 2012.
I'm talking about right now, since the CAO's office has asserted that these are great deals and there's no reason we should be going after them, essentially.
Well, from a financial perspective, I think that the CAO stands by its report that there's no reason today to terminate the swaps. You'd have to ask the city attorney's office on the other question.
So if we had done a fixed rate deal instead of this one, do we know what interest rates we would be likely to be paying now?
Yeah, we would be paying, I believe, in the fours, about 4.4, 4.5%. We'd be paying from 2006 to present $20 million more. We do know that in the convention center.
Well, I'm not sure if that's the right answer. Would we still be paying that, or would we not have refinanced already?
We wouldn't have been able to refinance because, like I said, it's a 10-year call. So we would not have been able to refinance until 2016.
And in other similar circumstances where we have refinanced, what have we done?
Right, but we were able to refinance because they were after the 10 years, so we have had lower interest rates. For example, at the convention center, when we terminated the swap in 2008 at the convention center, we ended up paying $10 million a year more in debt service. So from 2008 to now, we've paid $10 million a year more in debt service. So it has been costing us more in the convention center to have terminated the swap. But like I said, we had no option in the convention center because we could not get letters of credit to back the variable rate bonds.
So how many times have we done these advanced refund deals?
How many have we done? We've done quite a bit. We did them before 2008. They were very common because interest rates were higher. And there was investment rates were higher and interest rates were lower, so we were able to do advanced refundings. But today, we usually only look at what we call current refundings, which are within the 90-day period of when the bonds can be recalled. And as you know, in the last 2 to 3 years, when we come to you with bond deals, 90% of them have been refundings. So since 2008, we have saved something like $300 million doing these refundings. So every time there's an opportunity to refund, the CIO does come to you and do a refunding.
Now, why did the CAO's office do the report and publicly say that these are great deals and we made a lot of money on them and we shouldn't be going after the banks, when in fact the council is considering doing just that, and this totally undercuts our ability to seriously consider this issue?
I don't think that we're saying, I think what we're saying is when you look at the swap today, I think that we said is that financially, right now, we do not believe it makes sense to terminate the swap because we do have a $25 million termination payment. And we would have to issue taxable debt or cash to pay off that termination payment. So within the confines of the contracts of the swap, it doesn't make financial sense to do that. However, if there's a different way of terminating that swap, then that's something we'd look into. But today, under the current environment that those swaps are under, it doesn't make financial sense for us to do it. That's all we're saying.
Well, I think the report actually said we were better off having done the deal. Not that we're better off not paying our way out of it, that this is a great deal and it was financially remunerative. What we have been saying is that we should ask the banks to negate this disadvantageous swap and let us out without charging us the $25 million, because it was done in a very risky fashion without fully disclosing the risks to us and to every other city in the country that did them, and most of which are acknowledging that fact and going after them. It seems like only, I think Detroit has also taken this approach of saying, hey,
Detroit's doing it
we're
in bankruptcy.
fine. Right, and which makes it even worse in their case, because I think they've also said, hey, these are great, we actually made money on it. And they were forced by the bankruptcy judge to actually go after them, and ultimately did. So they had some leverage. Otherwise, they would have done the same thing that we're being asked to do by the CAO's office, which strikes me as quite bizarre. That's all my questions for now.
Mr. Blumenfield.
So I'm trying to understand how this all works, and obviously swaps are issues of risk and how you characterize those risks, and it seems to some extent nobody could have predicted the risk that we really underwent. And you're saying the only way we could have gotten something different would have been a fixed rate with a 10-year call. If we had perfect hindsight at the time and we knew what was going to happen, would we not have done something different, like a variable rate or issued paper? Would there not have been other ways to do this that would have been of greater savings? Granted, there was no way to know that. I'm not saying that we should have had a crystal ball, but just in terms of trying to understand the big picture. If we did know that the market was about to drop out.
I think we would have done maybe unhedged variable rate debt. That would have been a possibility. It also would have exposed us to more fluctuations in the interest rate market than a swap did. We could have done a fixed rate. I mean, those were our two basic options. We could have done a variable rate, unhedged, or we could have done a fixed rate. I mean, nobody is saying that we couldn't have. I'm just saying that at the time when we looked at the market.
Right. At the time we looked at the market,
Right.
there was no way.
If you're telling me if I were to look back today and know what I know today, of course I wouldn't have done.
Right. We would have
a swap.
done a fixed rate
Or an unhedged variable.
Something that could have been refinanced a couple of years later, because
Correct.
nobody would know that the rates would be so low, and that would have been the logical thing to do.
Yeah, and we're not saying we wouldn't have, but at the time, we weren't the only, wasn't the only option. I mean, there were also auction rate securities, which fell apart in 2008. which some cities are still trying to unwind from. Pasadena, for example, is barely unwinding its auction rate securities. So, yes, there were other options. You know, when we go to the marketplace, we look at all options at the time that we're doing it, and we try to assess those risks moving forward. 2008.
There's no way you could have predicted. I guess.
Yeah, I don't. It's unclear to me, how to answer that question, because knowing what I know today, of course I wouldn't have done a swap.
Right.
I would have gone into I would have gone a variable rate and refunded into fixed rate debt later on.
Right. And that's the logical answer. And so I guess the question that comes to mind now having hindsight, and this kind of borders on the legal stuff, is if the other side of that swap knew more than we did and participated in the market collapse, then do they bear responsibility for us? Because we were hedging against risk, right? We're hedging against, the whole point of a swap is to hedge risk, and risk of the unknown that potentially interest rates are going to go up, because that's why you're doing this swap. So it turned out in 2008, we know that there were some of those risks were artificially inflated because of the manipulation in the markets. No fault of our own, no way we could have predicted it. But knowing that the other side may have had more information there, that brings up a legal question.
Correct.
Does that make them legally liable? And a number of cities have been suing. And then it brings up the question of, okay, forget the legalities. That we know that whether they, because it's a lot harder to prove in a court of law that New York or Dexia manipulated the market, but we know that they benefited in this deal from that manipulation of the market. So then we come back now and say, okay, you benefited from an artificial changing of the market. We want to level the playing field now and make that fair. And I think that's the reason for the motion, is to put this forward and say we should negotiate, because whether they were participating or not, they unfairly benefited in this swap deal at our expense. Is that an accurate way to portray it?
That's a really difficult question. I'm not sure about the answer to that is. We benefited some, they benefited some. I hesitate to answer that question straight out. I do know that we are speaking to Bank of New York and to Dexia and trying to come to some accommodation. But again, on the legal part of it, we have a legal contract.
Well,
says,
and Ms. Brill, I don't think anybody here is going to ask you to give legal advice,
right,
particularly on a subject that may turn out in the future to be a subject of litigation.
Right.
So we're not going to ask you for your legal opinion here.
So, I don't know what the answer to that is.
And I guess, but that's the purpose of the motion, is to try to, as I understand it, but the motion maker can correct me if I'm wrong, is to put aside the legal question of whether we can go after them, because that's a bigger question, and whether or not they had enough liability in the manipulation is a legal question. But whether or not they benefited at our expense because of it, and whether or not that means that we have a right morally, so to speak, to then go after them and say, hey, we want to leverage. I guess that's what's on the table today. I'm trying to understand the motion, understand where we're going, but that's what's on the table today. And to help understand that, it helps to understand the benefits of what they could have known and how that could have helped them versus what we knew, and how we were either helped or hindered.
Right. What we knew was that by hedging the interest rate swap, it made sense at the time. We looked at the risks. We had policies that helped us look at those risks. We had financial advisors who are here today. We wrote the additional memo for you to look at.
But we looked at the risk as we understood them then.
At the time.
At the time. And there was
Correct.
No way that we would have predicted the real risks that were brewing out there in the
Correct.
world. And no one on earth can fault us, or any of these cities, for not understanding those risks that were out there. But the reality is the risks were out there, we didn't see them, not through a fault of our own, but because there was this manipulation going on.
Yeah, nobody saw them.
And then the question is, did they benefit substantially by that manipulation? And did we therefore not have fair risks in the deal?
I don't know the answer to that question.
That's the multi-million-dollar question. I
That is.
pass it back for the moment. Thank you.
Mr. Englander?
I guess what I'm getting out of this discussion, and I think it's a good lesson in the deep dive, so I appreciate you bringing the motion forward and all the research that's been done. I want to hear from the coalition. But what I'm hearing is if we knew then what we know now, we would have swapped out and not done the swap and swapped it for a hedge instead, hedged our bets. So I'd love to hear from the coalition as well and move on to the next
A couple more
speakers.
And we will do that as soon as Mr. Kretz
Oh, yes, of course.
completes his questions.
Yeah, one thing I would just point out, and I'd have to go through it again to find the spots, but I'm pretty sure this report actually didn't say, hey, if we could go back in retrospect, we wouldn't do it. It said, this was a great deal. We made money, and there's no problem with it. So which is it? Was it a good deal and still stands as a good deal, or was it something we never would have done in a million years in hindsight?
Well, I asked two different questions. I think at the time, we believed it was a good deal. Looking at the numbers today, doing our financial analysis, which is really all we would do, is yes, the swap is, in our opinion, should stay where it is. However, the council can tell us to do something.
But was it a good deal? That's a significant question.
At the time, yes. For the first 2 to 3 years of the swap, yes, it was. I mean, I think that plays out in the numbers that we presented to you.
But in 2020 hindsight,
Well, in
was this a
2020,
good deal?
Of course it wasn't a good deal. Neither was the convention center. I mean, they weren't good deals in hindsight because in 2008, the insurance market fell apart and everything fell apart. None of our commercial paper programs, none of our letters of credit were a good deal at that point. In hindsight, of course they weren't, but at the time, nobody had any idea that in 2008 the market would crash and burn and hurt cities the way that they did. And I don't think any city can say to you today that what they did then, if they would have known what they know today, they would have done what they were doing. Auction rate securities, letters of credit, commercial paper, interest rate, all of that fell apart in 2008. 3 companies went bankrupt. Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, and Merrill Lynch no longer exist. So I can't, it's very difficult for me to tell you that, yeah, this was a great deal when in 2008 the market fell apart. I don't think that's what we're trying to convey. We're trying to look at the swap objectively and say, today, seeing the market today and seeing what our options are and seeing what the contract is and seeing where we are compared to where we were then in 2006 with fixed rate, we believe what we wrote in the report. That's the best answer I can give you.
Now, it seems that private industry generally does very short-term swaps because that's actually a more fiscally responsible thing to do and less likely to trap you into risky situations. Why didn't we do 5-year swaps and roll them over so we weren't in that circumstance?
I think at the time, the conventional wisdom was to do 20-year swaps, I believe. I think Joe Mortensen from Prague can answer that question better than I can because I don't know very much about what other private sector or municipal sector did.
Hi, I'm Joe Mortensen from Public Resources Advisory Group. And to address that question, I can't really speak to why a private company would do shorter-term swaps versus longer-term swaps. I do know with this transaction, this was a refunding, and so there are 2 things that are important with a refunding. One is we were setting up an escrow to refund the bonds that were being refunded, and for tax law purposes, you have to have a yield because you can't exceed that yield on your escrow. The fixed rate, or the fixed rate proxy that's developed by doing the swap gives us that fixed rate yield. So over and above the fact that the fixed rate under the swap was better than the regular bond market fixed rate by a large margin, we couldn't just issue naked variable rate debt at the time because we were doing a refunding. The other is that when we're doing a refunding, we need to be able to report to council that we have achieved a certain amount of savings. And unless you have the cost of your debt fixed to the end, to the maturity of the bonds, you can't really tell what the savings will be. And so municipal issuers generally use swaps a lot for refundings, and they went to the maturity of the bonds that were being refunded. And the best benefit of the swaps was in the long end, not in the short end. That's why we refunded.
Right, so in 2012, that's why we refunded out 12 years. And we still came out with $500,000 of savings, even with the termination payment. We couldn't do that on the long end because interest rates are still too high on the long end.
So would you say that the bottom line is we still came out ahead on these?
Relative to a fixed rate alternative, yes. Through May 1st of this year, the swap transaction saved
about $20 million.
$25 million. A fixed rate transaction would have saved $3.3 million. So net, we're about $22 million to the good because of the swap transaction versus the fixed rate transaction we could have done back in 2006.
And that's assuming that we wouldn't have been able to refinance.
Right, because the tax law limits how many refundings you can do, and because that transaction back in 2006 was an advance refunding, that's why we couldn't call the bonds until the call date, which would have been 10 years later in 2016. Right. So we would not have had the opportunity to refund those bonds again.
Yeah, we would have to wait 2016 to refund those bonds.
And so are all of our fixed rate deals, do all of them require at least 10 years before they can be called?
It depends on the deals. We know that, for example, the Fig Plaza deal has a 7-year call because there was taxable debt on that deal, and we weren't sure what would happen to that piece of property over a 10-year period. If we would sell the property, we'd build a new city hall. We really didn't know. So we took a couple basis point penalty, meaning we paid a little bit more in interest rate in order to do a 7-year call. The other one where we did not have a 10-year call were the parking bonds. We had an 8-year call on the Mangrove property that we just refunded because, again, we bought this 10-acre piece of property and we weren't sure what we were going to do with it at the time. So we paid a little bit more in interest rate for the flexibility of being able to call 8 years. But 10-year call is the market standard for debt. There's no interest rate penalty. You don't pay a higher interest rate for having a 10-year call because investors know and expect you to call the debt in 10 years.
And one more time in terms of the 22 years, who advised us that we should do a 22-year non-refundable deal?
Well, Prague was our financial advisor at the time also that we did this deal, but we also went out to the marketplace, and the marketplace came back with a 20-year swap.
So that all the advice we were getting said do a 20-year or 20-year or more swap.
Because that was the industry standard at the time.
For municipalities.
To do a refunding to be able to
achieve the savings.
Have savings, because if you only did it for a short period of time, then you would have risk at that period that the swap would mature, that rates would be higher, and you could erase all the savings that you earned if interest rates were higher.
Now, if that didn't work if it wouldn't work to do a shorter term, why would it work in the private sector?
They may be doing it for different purposes.
They may not be doing a refunding.
Refinance debt.
They may be doing a true hedge, where they have contracts somewhere else and they're doing the swap to hedge against that contract.
Could it also be that it's a fiscally more prudent approach and that cities got taken for a ride by the same group of advisors all over the country?
I'm not going to speculate on that.
I think unless you know the reasons why they did the hedges that they did, because there are all kinds of interest rate swaps and all kinds of hedges are used for a variety of purposes. And unless you know what the purpose was, you can't really say what was more prudent.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'd like now to invite up the Fix LA Coalition to give its presentation. I think we have a PowerPoint queued up and ready to go, so if you could introduce yourselves and extend the floor to you. Good afternoon.
Hi.
Afternoon.
Afternoon.
We introduce ourselves and then talk? Or
If you don't mind.
Yeah, Lisa Cody, SCIU Research and Policy Analyst. Lisa Cody, SCIU Research and Policy Analyst.
Hi, my name is Wallace Turbeville. I'm a senior fellow at Demos, formerly tax-exempt bond lawyer, formerly municipal bond banker at Goldman, and formerly ran a derivatives risk management company.
I'm Brad Miller. I'm a lawyer now at the law firm of Grace and Ellsworth. I practiced law in North Carolina for 20 years. I broke bad in 2002 and was elected to Congress. I served there for a decade, including on the Financial Services Committee. It did not run for re-election in 2012. The firm that I now practice with represents plaintiff investors in structured finance litigation. And we have researched this issue on a pro bono basis to advise Americans for financial reform.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Chairman Krikorian and members of the committee, I appreciate and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I believe it is safe to say that no matter what side of the aisle you're on, no one disputes that Wall Street's reckless, unethical, and sometimes illegal actions caused the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression. That Wall Street made huge profits from its own reckless behavior before, during, and after the crisis, and today continues to do so. That the too big to fail and the too big to jail mentalities in this country have allowed financial institutions to run wild. We believe that LA should lead the way and set its own precedent, hold Wall Street accountable, and where others have not, and let Wall Street know that we're too big to be ignored. From the day the Fix LA Coalition was born, our goal has been to partner with the city, its council members, the CAO, the mayor, and others to spur initiatives aimed at reducing the fees that Wall Street takes from the city and redirecting those savings into the vital services that Angelenos desperately need. We reject the notion that the practices and assumptions of the financial industry are fixed and unchangeable, and so should the city of LA. We must shine a light on the nature and extent of the city's transactions with Wall Street, creating a level of transparency that has no parallel and will facilitate a greater understanding of the potential savings that can be achieved. We applaud and appreciate that the CAO has already committed to implementing a debt management database to better track all costs associated with debt. In our report, No Small Fees, the coalition does not question or criticize the city's need to issue debt to pay for infrastructure and public services, nor do we suggest that the city does not vigorously negotiate to get market rates. We do question, however, whether the market rates Wall Street is offering municipalities are reasonable and fair. In fact, there's a growing chorus of academic and industry experts, some of whom you will hear testify today, that a troubling nationwide trend is that municipalities are getting ripped off, that municipalities pay significantly more than other market participants for essentially the same product. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman had this to say about financial innovations such as interest rate swaps. Quote, "They were promoted as ways to spread risk, making investment safer for municipalities. What they did instead, aside from making their creators a lot of money, which they didn't have to repay when it all went bust, was to spread confusion, luring investors into taking on more risk than they realized. We believe that government officials must take bold action to do whatever it takes to prevent the fleecing of taxpayers going forward, and to recoup losses that have occurred as a result of the deceptive marketing of derivatives, such as interest rate swaps, by Wall Street firms. We ask that the city pursue every possible avenue, whether legislative, regulatory, legal, or otherwise, to reduce fees the city pays to Wall Street, to renegotiate bad deals, to invest those savings in order to better serve the people of Los Angeles. We have suggested the following to that end: reduce fees through the insourcing of financial advisors, explore legislative or administrative remedies that would permit the city to negotiate debt as a single entity with one credit rating, or develop methods which more effectively compete banks against one another, explore alternative sources of credit enhancement for the city's debt, pursue all legal actions against banks that manipulated interest rate indexes, exercise its fiduciary responsibility to taxpayers by exploring all options to renegotiate the swaps deal that over the life of the bonds will cost the city over $50 million in losses, and I'll show you what we mean by that. When and if negotiation fails, refuse to do business with banks that are happy to profit off the very products they created to deceive the public. So it's within this context that of the coalition's collaborative approach to helping the city save money that we find the nature and tone of the CAO's May 30th and June 27th reports both troubling and problematic. Although we appreciate the CAO's discussion of why the city issues debt and how interest rates compare with other municipalities, we fail to see how the report addresses the coalition's concerns about fees the city of LA is paying for its financial transactions. Furthermore, making these comparisons misses the point, which is that municipal governments in general are likely paying far too much, and much more than players in the private sector. To be blunt, the idea of comparing Los Angeles' record in this area with that of other municipalities would be like comparing two ships and finding that one is doing better because the other one is sinking more slowly. However, the most troubling aspect of the CAO's report is the position that was taken with regard to the city swap deals with Mellon and Dexia. The CAO has asserted, even with the benefit of hindsight, quote, "The bottom line is we still ended up ahead. The swaps are saving us money." According to a newspaper article, the CAO asserted as well, from 2014 through 2028, the swaps will save an additional $22.9 million over fixed-rate debt. We assert that these statements are incorrect and are based on a false premise. So this is why the city said it bought swaps. For the cost of the swaps, the program's getting a hedge against rising interest rates. The city locked itself into a fixed rate or a synthetic fixed rate in 2006 at a time when interest rates were thought to be at historic lows. The city expected that interest rates would increase. The city would receive higher amounts of money from its counterparties, meaning Mellon and Dexia. And as those payments are based on the variable rate index that increases, as the same rates on the bonds would increase, although not always at the same proportion, and in the end that they'd get their fixed synthetic rate. So the swaps did give the city a hedge against rising interest rates, and the city did get its synthetic 3.34%. However, the city was then trapped into that 3.34% for the duration of the bonds, unless it wanted to pay a prohibitively expensive termination fee. So that 22 years, through that time, interest rates could go up, they could go down, but basically, unless we paid a termination fee, we couldn't take advantage of any decreases in those rates. So the city of Los Angeles, during the periods when it was strapped for cash during the Great Recession, was stuck with a synthetic fixed rate that had become a bad deal. Gretchen Morgenson of the New York Times described the plight of cities like Los Angeles in the following: like millions of homeowners, shrewd state and local governments are looking to refinance. Interest rates have hit rock bottom. So why not save some public money by replacing old debts with new ones at lower rates? The bad news for taxpayers is that such easy refis are out of the question for many governments and agencies short on cash. And that's because borrowers have been trapped by Wall Street. So I want to go through and actually look at the comparisons that the CAO made in both of its reports, and then compare them to what we see as a feasible alternative to what was presented. So the true cost of the swaps start with the $104.1 million, which was reported by the CAO, and we agree. That's the total amount of the bonds times the synthetic fixed rate times the 9 years. You get, with liquidity and issuance cost, you get $104 million. The alternative that was given in the report assumes that we would never refund those bonds. And I realize that there's a call, a 10-year call on those. I've been told and been advised that even if the debt was refunded, there are ways to advance refund that debt. So, but just for this purpose, in the CAO's example, the whole debt is held at 4.3% for those same 9 years. And we don't disagree with that number either. It's going to be about $125.8 million. We, however, do not believe that's a realistic scenario. Assuming that the city would not refund its debt in 2012, for example, when interest rates hit historic lows, when the city refunded 3 different wastewater projects, MICLA, general obligation bonds. In fact, I think Councilman Cardenas went on the record saying they'd even give them extra staff and pay them extra if they could hurry up on the refinances and the refundings, because there was such a great opportunity for savings. So with a fixed rate deal, the city could have refinanced at any point. And after Wall Street crashed the economy, the federal government cut interest rates to record lows. With a variable rate bond with swaps, the city gave up its option to refund unless you pay $26 million in termination fees. Thus, the city was unable to take advantage of rock bottom interest rates. So giving up that option, which is what you do when you enter into a swap, for 22 years is going to cost you millions of dollars over the life of the bond because of the opportunities lost to refinance at lower rates. We know that they would have refunded because whenever we don't have a swap, we refund. The city's debt management policy states that the CAO must monitor potential savings available by refunding. The city has saved hundreds of millions of dollars in the last 5 years through refunding. That's something they put in their report. And even at the cost of the termination fee, we chose to refund half that debt. And I would say, too, if it wasn't advantageous to end the swap at the portion of the swaps, why did we refund? That's just a question later. So the overall cost of the swap, I'm going to move this, are the following. The $104.1 million. So the city refunded part of its debt in 2012 into a fixed rate interest rate at 1.887%. So it refunded $164 million worth of bonds at 1.887% for the first 12 years. That produces a $34.2 million. However, in order to do that, the city had to come up with $26 million. So it issued more debt. So the refunding in 2012 included the $26.1 million. Therefore, you need to include in any cost over the life of the bond $5.4 million on that additional debt. In addition, you have to pay back that $26.1 million because it's part of the principal. And you have the principal, swap payments, and all the related costs going forward for the $151 million you have left on your swapped debt. You also have letters of credit required for the swaps deals, and I gave a average letter of credit 0.55 basis, or 55 basis points. The total cost of the swap of the life of the deal, $247.3 million. In a fixed rate scenario, the first 6 years of your 4.3% of the total debt is going to cost you $81 million. If you refund that debt in 2012, and you refund it at a blended rate, let's say, the CAO was able to get 1.887 on short-term maturities. So on long-term maturities, you're likely to have a much higher rate, probably 3.7, 3.9. If you blend a rate and say, let's just 3% for the remainder of the debt, you're going to pay $104.5 million total. You're going to probably have to pay a call premium as well because you've called the debt before 10 years. And that's usually a 3% of the remaining debt. So your total is $194.5 million, which is the total fixed rate interest rate with 2012 refunding. So the difference here over the life of the two scenarios, the variable rate swaps deal is at $247.3 million. Your fixed rate no swap is at $194.5 million. Thus, the swaps deal is costing the city over $50 million. So the trap with the swap is that it gave up its option to refinance when there were historic lows. The city was locked into that deal for 22 years. It would have to pay another $25 million or so to get out of the deal. We're not suggesting, by the way, that the city should get out of the deal by paying the termination fee. That would not be in the city's financial interest. Financial institutions sold these swaps to extract profits. They do not make money off playing interest rates off debt. They make money off fees. In the private sector, there's no such thing as a swaps deal for 22 years. If you went onto an over-the-counter market, you'd never find one. In the private sector, swaps deals range from 1 to 7 years. So that's the end of my presentation.
Should I go? Yeah. Hi. Let me switch now. I'm going to use this in a second. A couple things. Just some observations. I want to be clear that, in my perspective, that the deal was not a good idea in 2006, and it would not have been a good idea in 2006 whether or not the financial crisis would have occurred. So I think we got to be very careful in saying that when we say that the deal was a bad idea when it happened, it's not simply because the financial crisis occurred, but because of a matrix of risks and costs that were associated with the 2006 transaction when that happened. And so I don't think it's a fair thing to say nobody could have foreseen the financial crisis. I think that's true, although there was an economist at Goldman Sachs that seems to have. But that's not what's really at issue here. I was also struck by a phrase that was used earlier, and I wrote it down. It was said that the swap was done to achieve a fixed amount of debt service. And I was reading a report by Prague that seems to have come out last week, and it uses a phrase: the city swaps convert floating rates to fixed rates to reduce interest rate risk. Swaps are used instead of fixed rate bonds because they can, under certain market conditions for certain bond maturities, provide much lower fixed rates than the municipal bond market can provide. Swaps don't provide rates. The interest rate that you're paying on the bonds, or we're paying on the bonds from the beginning, was a floating rate. A swap is an executory contract that you depend on other people to perform, which may or may not offset a variable rate of interest, but that means that those people have to perform. And that has profound consequences on what you decide to do with your financings. It doesn't create a fixed rate. It's a contract with somebody else that you hope actually works out, all right? So that's a very different thing. There's also been a lot of discussions about, what would a refunding in 2000...
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you
Yes.
just for a minute? Is there any indication that these parties did not perform according to the terms of that executory contract?
No, it's just...
Okay, so what's the difference?
What's the difference?
You mean just in terms of risk,
Yes, in terms
risk
of-
assessment
in terms of
before you enter into the deal?
In terms of risk. And what I'm troubled by is not that just that it says that the swap provides the right, it ignores the fact that there's this superstructure underneath this thing that's a variable rate transaction which has all the risk implications with that layered on top of a swap transaction that has a lot of risk as well, including this whole termination payment thing, which is a form of risk and consequence to the city. So what you have is a bit of a Rube Goldberg kind of a construction, where the primary analysis for it was, when it was done, as I understand it, was you're saving in the straightforward costs, and we've looked at some of these other risks. I don't think all of the other risks, but some of the other risks, and they're manageable, and we'll take care of it. When in fact, just mathematically, the compounding of risk of all of this put together would be is not wise. But I'm
I try to translate it into simple terms that I will understand.
sure.
So are you saying then that because it's an executory contract, if there's wide variation in the actual interest rate and there's a performance expected of that party with whom the municipality is contracting, as that vector widens, there's a greater risk of non-performance because they may choose not to, or there may be market failure or some other reason that they choose not to perform. That's a risk that we should take into account before entering into a transaction like this.
Yes, and what's most troubling is that the language is used as always to really simplify it down so that it sounds like it's very benign. And that's troubling. That's really what's troubling me, is that there's this matrix of risk that was underneath this transaction, and the language, even today, that's being used is, oh, we got a fixed rate. Well, you didn't get a fixed rate. You got a construct that you hope to.
I followed.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
And one of the issues here is, we're also sort of looking at comparison cases that don't exist anymore, and are we're trying to construct what ifs when what ifs that are retrospective are sometimes tough to do. But whether the bonds would have been issued with a 10-year call or an 8-year call or not, whether the bond would have been refundable either in advance, slightly in advance, or in 2013 instead of 2012, I don't think is really the issue. The issue is that the city locked itself into a 22-year deal where any refinancing hope that the city might have, whenever it would occur, would automatically be paid directly. The value of that would be paid directly to the banks, and that was the nature of that structure, and that's a very inflexible structure to get into, and I think that's problematic. So thank you for doing that. This to give you an idea of what it looked like. Just bear with me for a few minutes. Right here we have the basis of the 2006 deal, which is, I've just muted nothing. But the basis of the 2006 deal is $316.8 million of variable rate bonds, bondholders, and the city pays. You have to add on top of that bond insurance for credit support and liquidity support, and then a remarketing agent. Each one of those elements are elements that in 2006 had to work well over time, for over 2 decades, for this thing to work. So you're signing up for a very long-term transaction with other players in the market. In fact, what failed in this regard, most importantly, was the bond insurance, because the bond insurer was downgraded. But as of 2006, the city was depending on those 3 parties to actually perform to perform well over the life of the transaction for it to work out. And then finally, the swap was layered on top of it. So my point is that this was a matrix of risk that came together, and it was a matrix of risk that was to save some interest costs. But where were these risks quantified so that when you were comparing the interest costs that you would have experienced on a fixed rate deal, a simple deal, as compared with the true cost, not just the interest cost, but the risk-adjusted cost of doing this complex financing, where was that? And I don't think that was available. There were people said, oh, there were these other things out there, but nobody really gave the city, apprised the city of what kind, how would one go about quantifying those costs, because maybe the risk-adjusted cost would have gone the other way. I suspect it would have. So that's what you ended up with. So the basic benefit of the VRDB swap transactions was that there were lower costs if interest rates stayed high over the life of the transaction, because there was no further refunding, and assuming that the VRDB swap structure survived. But because of the long-term swap, refinancing benefits were foregone. Now, there's, deals can get refinanced lots of different ways. If in 2012 one was to try to refinance this entire deal, one might lock in, there's a lot of ways to lock in the low interest rates in 2012 if the actual refunding were going to occur in, say, 2014 or even 2015 or 16. So it's a little bit of a simplification to say that you were powerless to achieve low interest rate if there were assuming there was some technical reason to not do the immediate refunding in 2012. But there are many, many different ways to do a refinancing. But more importantly was the risk of the VRDB swap structure. There was basis risk, meaning that the swap was not at your tax-exempt rate, but was at a percentage of LIBOR. And that risk, it turns out so far, has not been a problem, but it can be a problem in the future. Let's just think of one way that could be a problem. If it's as a percentage of LIBOR is what's supposed to offset your tax-exempt rate. Here's 64% of LIBOR supposed to. What if perhaps Congress were to miraculously act and do tax reform so that marginal tax rates, loopholes were closed and marginal tax rates went down? Then that interest rate would be insufficient to offset the interest cost on your variable rate, because if marginal rates go down, the value of the tax exemption goes down. So as a percentage of LIBOR, a taxable rate, your rate would go up. So there are there's this external risk that might catch you. There's cash liquidity risk if the swap is terminated early. Our friends in Detroit know about that in spades. But then again, there's no particular reason to know for certain that the great city of Los Angeles will, for over 2 decades, each and every year, not get into some kind of a problem. And if you get into some kind of a problem and get a downgrade, you may well end up in a situation where you have to terminate swaps early and pay a lot of cash right now. Basically pay all of the payments that were going to go to the bank today. And that's not a very pleasant place to be in. There was the risk of the credit risk of the insurer. That's indeed what happened. It went down. Credit risk of the LC bank and credit risk of remarketing, that they're also problematic. So all of these risks pulled together. We've talked a lot about this refinancing thing, but I think it's and maybe it's we don't need to go too much further into that. But just in addition to all of these risks that were part of that deal and made it very problematic in 2006, the idea of foreclosing your flexibility for more than a couple of decades is one that's really troubling. And here's how this works. if you want to get out of the swap deal, what you have to pay the bank is the following. Fundamentally, you take the interest cost, the floating rate cost that you're experiencing right now, that is the floating rate side that the bank's paying you, and the fixed payment that you're paying the bank. The difference between those two right now, under current interest rate environments, for the balance of the swap, whatever's left outstanding, you have to give the bank the value of all of that today to get out of the swap. And what that means is any flexibility you might have in the financial markets to deal with this is simply sucked out of the deal and given to the bank if you choose to terminate. Now, you might choose to do that anyway, as long as two things are true. One, that the value the banks suck out are actually somewhat less than the interest cost savings you might have from doing a refinancing right now. And that happened in 2012. So the city decided to terminate a fraction of the swap, about half of the swap. And what it did was it picked those maturities of debt where you could actually refinance and do it flat, where all you paid to the banks was fundamentally every red penny you were going to make on the refinancing. And they did that. But they didn't refinance the rest of the swap deal. And the reason was those maturities where the banks were actually going to take out more than you could have made from refinancing, they left that outstanding. So what happened in 2012 was not some great idea to save some money by doing a refinancing. They picked half of the deal. They had a small amount of savings, $500,000 left over, but basically they got out of the swap flat. So my question is, if it isn't true that the swap structure is so troubling, why did they do that? Why did they do that? I think that the only answer that's reasonable to conclude, you're over there, hi. The only answer that's reasonable to conclude, I'll talk to you from now on. The only reason that's reasonable to conclude is they actually did want to pay down some of the risk of this structure, and they did it and picked as much of it as they could pick and redo so that they didn't do worse than paying it all to the banks. And that's what they did. So I think what happened in 2012 sort of underscores the gist of what we're saying here, which is that structure was too complex and shouldn't have been done in the first place. There's other stuff I'm going to turn in, but it seemed like it was useful to address what was going on and not take up any more of your time. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chairman Krikorian, I think, like all of you, but unlike experts in municipal finance or most lawyers, I have spent a lot of time talking to third grade classes. So I have tried to remind myself always to put things as understandably as possible. Explaining synthetic fixed rate municipal financing for third grade class is not easy, but if I fail, please ask me any questions that occur to you.
No, with me you can go right up to 5th or 6th grade level. It's fine. We don't need to make it too
I don't have time to change my remarks now, but thank you. Your colleagues will benefit. I don't claim to be an expert in municipal finance. The law firm that I'm now with has researched the legal issues based on the assumption that, as Wallace Tuberville just described, and as we've heard from other long-standing professionals in municipal finance, these transactions were not just disadvantageous to the public sector borrowers with the benefit of hindsight, but they were at the time the transactions were entered. Because the things that went wrong were known risks at the time. And if those very things hadn't gone wrong, something else might have gone wrong. But there were known risks that made these bad deals. And that risk was not described, was not explained in the way that the law required. Just a little more than a decade ago, public finance, borrowing by public entities had been pretty much the same for decades. It was fairly standard. It was well understood. There were plenty of buyers for public debt, mostly old rich people. The public entities that needed to borrow got reasonable terms. Nobody was clamoring for change. The reason we ended up with the very complex deals that Wallace Tuberville just described was not to improve municipal finance, either for the borrowers, for the issuers, like the City of Los Angeles, or for the investors. It was to make more money from the transactions for the banks, the underwriting banks. Without addressing the specific circumstances of Los Angeles, similar financings like these, created significant risk that was lopsidedly, if not entirely, borne by the issuers. Congress created in 1975, by statute, by an amendment to the securities laws, the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, and gave it the authority, the task, of developing market integrity rules for municipal finance. And the MSRB has had for decades a fair dealing rule that prohibits deceptive, dishonest, or unfair conduct towards anyone, not just the investors who buy the bonds, but also by the public entities that issue bonds. And the rule recognizes that there is a disparity between underwriters, the banks, and even the most sophisticated issuers, which almost certainly would include the City of Los Angeles. There are plenty of other public entities around the country that entered into these deals with their eyes more closed than certainly the City of Los Angeles. In understanding these mind-numbingly complex financings that were designed by the underwriters to make money for the underwriters. The MSRB issued an interpretive notice and guidance on the implementation of that notice in 2012 that was specifically directed to the duties of underwriters in complex financings like these. The MSRB said that the substance of the required disclosures arise from the same fundamental duty of fairness to the issuer that the MSRB has already required under the rule for some time. In other words, this is not just prospective. This was what their rule had always meant. The MSRB said the underwriter could not treat a presentation to an issuer, a public entity that was looking to borrow, as merely a sales pitch without regulatory consequence. It had to be something the issuers could rely upon to be true and accurate. The guidance requires the underwriters, the banks, to disclose the material financial characteristics of the complex municipal securities financings as well as the material risks of the financing that are known to the underwriter and reasonably foreseeable at the time of disclosure, including the risks associated with a recommended swap. The disclosure should be sufficient to allow the issuer to assess the magnitude of its potential exposure as a result of the complex municipal securities financing. The disclosures must be in a fair and balanced way based on principles of fair dealing and good faith. The guidance said that page after page of complex legal jargon would not satisfy the requirements. Major banks now argue that the financial crisis was an unforeseeable perfect storm, a black swan. Others, including the majority of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, disagree. Every major underwriting bank employed teams of physicists who were running complex models on supercomputers, but also economists, well-credentialed economists who could have held a named chair on any university faculty in the world. They knew something was up, or they knew something could come up. They knew what the risks were. If you were to look at their internal documents, it is undoubtedly the case that they knew things could go wrong in these financings. If they didn't know precisely what would go wrong, they knew that something would go wrong. That's what risk means. It doesn't mean that it's certain. It's something that may happen.
I'm
sure.
sorry, Congressman, can I just interrupt?
Got to go to the sixth grade level?
So a little, yeah, you've gone up to seventh grade. So, so are you saying then that the failure to disclose related to the fundamental nature of the transaction
Yes.
and inherent risk defects in the transaction, or are you saying that there's a failure to disclose relating to the overall likelihood of a fundamental collapse in the global economy, or some combination of those?
It was the former.
Okay.
The idea was that, as Wallace Turville has already described, that there were the debt that would be issued would not be fixed rate, would be variable rate, and there'd be these complicated mechanisms for determining what the interest rate would be. It was basically market for both auction rate securities, which you apparently didn't have, and variable rate demand bonds, which you did have. It would be based upon the market. What would people be willing to pay on a weekly basis for buying these bonds? And then there was a swap based on LIBOR. And the way it was explained was these would offset. That if interest rates went up, then the swaps would do better by you. You'd be able to make up what you were paying in additional interest rates by what you got back from the counterparty on the swap.
Right.
Instead of staying in tandem, they diverged dramatically. And they diverged dramatically because they were really different. The mechanism by which the interest rate on the bonds was determined was really different from LIBOR. And they knew that. They must have known that. These aren't dumb guys. Say what you like about them. They're not dumb. They knew that that was a very real possibility. And that is, in fact, exactly what happened.
Gotcha.
Whether it would have happened, and obviously it happened much worse because of the financial crisis, but there was a very real chance, certainly over the long term of these obligations, that something like that was going to happen. I haven't seen what kind of presentations were made to the city of Los Angeles, but I have seen other presentations, the PowerPoints. I hope you'll forgive me for not having a PowerPoint with me today.
Oh, I bless you for not having a PowerPoint. No offense to PowerPoint presenters or anything, but...
And the presentations were a sales pitch. Exactly what the MSRB said they can't be. They can't just be a sales pitch. That's what they were. To the extent that they discussed the risk at all, it minimized the risk. It may have mentioned it, but it certainly didn't dwell on it, and it certainly didn't put the issuer in the position of being able to make a calm, sober assessment of what might go wrong and how that might affect them. And that is what the law required. That is what the MSRB rule required. There has been a handful of, you have gotten, I think that Commissioner Koretz put in your packet a memorandum that Ross Wallins and I wrote to Americans for Financial Reform on what the SEC might do about this. And they are urging the SEC to pursue enforcement action. And I'm sure that Americans for Financial Reform and a lot of the public employee unions that are here are members of American for Financial Reform would welcome your support in that call to the SEC. But we also think that there are remedies that are available to the city if you believe that this was a bad deal and that what was bad about it was not properly disclosed at the time. There are a handful, I think 3 cases in lower federal courts that say because the statute does not mention a lawsuit, because the statute mentions enforcement by the SEC, it also mentions arbitration, that you don't have a claim in court. You don't have a private right of action. But the statute, in addition to giving the MSRB authority to issue market integrity rules, also gives the MSRB the authority to set up arbitration for any disputes under their rules.
With what remedies?
Well, it doesn't say.
Okay.
But the remedies that we've seen coming out of other similar, really only one arbitration, was pretty generous. got back everything that already paid on the swaps and got out of the termination fee. That would be a pretty generous remedy. You would be very happy if you got that. I'm not promising by any means that you would. I think all the other lawyers at the firm are kind of horrified by how unclear the remedies are. But I've spent 18 years in public office, 10 in Congress, 8 in the legislature, based upon just a general sense of what fair is. So I'm totally okay with the remedy that is not completely spelled out. If the arbitrators think that the law required more of the underwriting banks than what they did, the remedy would probably be very, very generous. Rescission, the remedy that was in the one case that I mentioned earlier, would be a very generous remedy. Just the difference between where you would have been if you'd entered another transaction that you probably should have entered instead versus where you were going to end up in this one would be a pretty good remedy. It would be, a lot of damages, a lot of recovery. There is one issue that may be peculiar to the West Coast. The Ninth Circuit, the appellate court for California and other states nearby, has the banks, instead of having provisions in their contracts that say that the exclusive remedy shall be through arbitration, which is sort of the norm, they say the exclusive remedy shall be through litigation. And the Ninth Circuit said that kind of rule, that kind of provision is effective. It's a very recent decision. It's a developing area of the law. There are probably things about these transactions that can distinguish this from that case, but that is a possibility of something that could go wrong.
I didn't understand. You're saying.
Say that again?
How does that make it different, that it's arbitration versus legislation?
Because if you want to be in arbitration because the courts have said there is no remedy in court.
Right.
And that is, I think, actually how it can be distinguished, is most cases that talk about arbitration, it's usually an arbitration clause. It says you've got to arbitrate, you can't litigate. The courts usually say, well, yeah, but you can bring the same claims and ask for the same relief in either court or arbitration. In this case, you can't. If those three district court cases are correct and there's no private right of action in court, the only way you can get relief is through arbitration. And so that is not just that clause there. If it is, in fact, even in your contracts and talking to your city attorney's office, it's not clear that you've got it at all. But if it is in there, it's not just a choice of forum. It is essentially saying you're out of luck. This claim is extinguished. And a court might very well not go that far. If you're going to do something, you should do it quickly. The FINRA rules say that their phrase, it's like a statute of limitations, only different. It says that to be eligible for arbitration, the claimant must bring the claim within 6 years of the events or transactions that give rise to the claim. But they're pretty flexible about when that clock starts running. They look at discovery. If you think you got hosed, when did you figure that out? When was it reasonable that you figured it out? Was it reasonable that you continued to rely upon the judgment of the bank you were dealing with? And FINRA also looks at a continuing series of transactions. If you kept doing business with the same set of folks, that, when you stop doing business with them, is when the clock starts. So there's a very good chance that your claims are not time barred if you decide you do have claims and you want to bring them. But it's always better to bring it without having to worry or only worrying as little as you can about whether you've got a time problem. The one case I mentioned earlier said that the earliest the statute, the time limitation, could have begun to run was October of 2008, because that's when these deals blew up. That's when the financial crisis really hit, and the two interest rates diverged in a way that was so disadvantageous for issuers. But in any case, if you're going to do something, you should do it. Did I say within the 6th grade?
I caught most of it, so
Okay.
thank you.
So,
Mr. Kretz.
so just to clarify, if we are going to take some action you're saying to be on the safe side of not having any kind of statute of limitations run, that we should take that action before October of this year.
Yes, that's not to say that there is absolutely no way that that a FINRA arbitration panel wouldn't say that the clock started running later than October 2008. And it's not to say that a FINRA arbitration panel couldn't say that the clock started running before that, in which case you might lose on timeliness. But the sooner the better.
Mr. Blumenfield?
And by action, we're not talking about necessarily litigation.
Right.
I mean,
Well, there are some other advantages in arbitration. It's private. You don't get the sense that you're having a fight with your banks in public. There's not quite the sense of your kind of airing dirty laundry in public. I mean, it's designed to be less formal, quicker, and it's not in open court. There's some folks who don't want to say things right out loud in front of God and everybody in open court that will say it in arbitration, and that might be an advantage.
Well, and further to not saying things in front of God and everybody, Congressman.
Is that a phrase used in Los Angeles as well?
It is. I want to thank you for your service to our country. Thank you for being here and your counsel. I think this committee would be well advised, and I'm going to propose as a friendly amendment to Mr. Kretz's motion that we actually refer the Fix LA Coalition report and recommendations, as well as the CAO's reports, to the city attorney, with the request that the city attorney's office evaluate legal remedies that the city may have arising out of these transactions. So I'd like to propose that as a friendly amendment, Mr. Kretz. If
that would be more than friendly, because I was thinking essentially along the same line. So that would be great.
No, absolutely.
Great.
Thank
All
you.
right. Any other questions for this panel members? Mr. Kretz?
Oh, I just wanted to point out you still have some speakers for the public.
We are going to get to that. Yeah, I wanted to make sure, though, that we were done here first. Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. No, I'm going to get to that. Yeah, I'm going to get to that. We're not going to take action. Okay, so we do have some cards on this matter. So I'm going to offer 2 minutes per speaker, and you don't need to take all of it if you don't wish. But it's up. But you may if you choose. We're going to start with Mark Lipman, followed by Gloria Villamil, followed by Floyd Glenn Lambert. Mr. Lipman, welcome.
Good afternoon. I'm Mark Lippman with the group Power and also Fix LA. First, I would like to thank Mr. Koretz for his description of Wall Street. It saves me the time because Wall Street is basically a den of thieves, and we know this. Just to put a little perspective on my following comments, I study, analyze, and write books on the economy, so I can tell you that the crash of 2008 was predictable because I did predict this back in 2006, watching the validity of the Wall Street stock market. And I was telling all my friends back then to stay out of the housing market because it was about to burst. Back then, no one wanted to listen to me. Maybe my foresight can help you with your hindsight. Wall Street did know that the crash was coming because they were in charge of Wall Street. The Fed, run at the time by Ben Bernanke, was from Wall Street. So yes, they did know this was coming. Now, something that we can do about it, a legal remedy that you might want to consider, is a legal precedent known as odious debt, or also known as illegitimate debt, whereby debt can be vacated when you show that, to the lender's knowledge, that debt was not made for the public good. we can see that this debt was not made for the benefit of the people of Los Angeles. So I would propose to you that we can consider also to vacate this debt altogether. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Gloria Villamil, followed by Floyd Glenn Lambert, and then Reverend Jonathan Mosley.
Thank you. I am a victim of the banks and their predatory practices. I lost my home in 2006. I was a victim of a financial advisor that told me to go to his bank and change my perfectly good conventional fixed rate to a very complex thing that I did not understand. I lost my retirement money, which I had as equity in my home. The banks took that in a series of legal con artistry complex scheme of abusive predatory practices. Along that, I witnessed the best workers of my city lose their homes, their jobs, their retirement, their children forced out of schools and universities. I witnessed homelessness, hunger, desperation, suicide. I witnessed along this billions of bailout money from the government to the banks, which I never saw a dollar to this day. No justice to this day on this issue. The fabric of the city and the whole country's cities desperately needs to be mended. Here is a clear opportunity for our city to make sure that our hard-earned money stays here in LA for desperately needed services, and to make sure there is transparency, which is not a favorite practice of banks. Please don't let our city fall victim of the banks again. This is not recession. This is robbery.
Our next speaker is Floyd Glenn Lambert, followed by Reverend Jonathan Mosley. Reverend, come on up, and Reverend Mosley will be followed by Jacob Miller. Mr. Glenn Lambert, welcome.
Thank you. Council members, my name is Floyd Glenn Lambert. I'm President, Jewish Labor Committee, Western Region, and our organization is a member of the Fix LA Coalition. I'm here today representing many of our members who are city residents who are furious with the level of service that our city provides at this point. Coming out of the Great Recession and the bank collapse, our members, our city is working with nearly 5,000 fewer city employees than at the beginning of the recession, and we're hurting. We're hurting as a community. Service takes longer to receive services, and we're all suffering as a result of it. This deal with Dexia and Mellon should be looked at closely, and we believe it should be renegotiated, and it is in the interest of our community to do so. So I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Reverend Mosley, followed by Jacob Miller, followed by Peggy Mears.
Good afternoon, Reverend Jonathan Mosley, National Action Network, and also working with Fix LA. I'm here because of more than just one reason. One of the principal reasons is the moral issue that has victimized this great city. It's a city I grew up in. I've watched and seen how the predatory lenders have just taken advantage and have abused the people that make up this great city. It's not fair that they can walk away with these humongous bonuses for having ripped off people unjustly. We see people losing their homes, children not able to go to school, quality of life being just totally disintegrated, and yet we say that this is a great city. I think the main reason is that we have to hold people accountable. And once they refuse to be accountable, that there should be the necessary legal actions taken toward them as they would from anybody else. I hate to say it, but they're no different to me than John Dillinger, Jesse James, or Bonnie and Clyde. The difference is they robbed from the poor and only fattened their rich pockets. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Jacob Miller, followed by Peggy Mears, followed by Azar Najad, and that's the last card that I have for the moment. So if anybody else would like to be heard, please fill out one of these cards and bring it forward, please. Mr. Miller.
Good afternoon. I've been an animal care technician with Los Angeles Animal Services now for 13 years, as well as a proud union worker, lifelong Los Angeles resident, and an advocate for efficient and fiscally responsible government. Los Angeles, since the market crash, has felt the sting of austerity, which has resulted in the nearly 15% reduction in services provided to the public, all while the taxpayer continues to pay for 100% service delivery. No one has felt this more than my department of Animal Services, which by this body and other committees has been named the most dangerously underfunded department in the city even before the crash. The effects of this crash have only served to exacerbate the problem with more and more animals being surrendered by their owners because of financial and housing hardships. Under our new mayor, we have been asked to go back to the basics. I view this also as using basic solutions to solve basic problems. Here's a prime example of doing just that. The problem is we're paying too much in fees to banks that do nothing to help the working, lower, and middle class stay in a home, lift their families out of poverty, and never-ending cycle of paycheck-to-paycheck life. The solution is renegotiating these bank fees. Bottom line, banks out of necessity want and will continue to do business with Los Angeles, and we hold all the good cards in our hand. So let's renegotiate and get a better deal. Begin saving the city money, which could be instead reinvested back into the communities, the services provided to the communities, and ultimately back into the system that made these banks possible. By this, I'm referring to the system of public servants charged with providing us all well-maintained roads and sidewalks, clean and trash-free neighborhoods, and safe and secure communities. This basic solution has been approached by other similar cities and saved them a ton of money. This is only a first step, though. The journey to a fiscally sound, well-maintained city responsive to the needs of its community will only be complete after addressing this and other issues such as better collections and enforcement of the blight ordinance. This ordinance is yet to collect anything, while other cities like Oakland were able to bring in tens of millions each month. Can you imagine the possibilities in LA? And, of course, giving the city workers a fair contract that restores services to our communities and fixes LA is a must. Thank you very much for bringing the fee renegotiations forward.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Peggy Mears, followed by Azar Najad, and that will be our final speaker, unless someone else comes forward.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Peggy Mears, and I am an organizer with ACE and part of the Fix LA Coalition. I grew up in South LA, and I care about this city, and I'm sure we all do. We're here all because we want to fix LA. After Wall Street recklessly destroyed the economy in 2008, it seems that the people of this city and all around this country have had to suffer for their reckless disregard. However, the bankers get richer and richer every day, while our communities are left to suffer. These are the very same Wall Street banks that have devastated our community. During the 1980s, over 1,000 banksters went to jail for their nefarious deeds. However, with this recession, or so-called recession, which is a depression to a lot of us, I'm sure, not one bankster has gone to jail. That's unacceptable, and we have to fix that. In addition to being one of the largest owners of vacant foreclosed properties in LA that have cost our city tens of thousands of dollars to maintain, Bank of New York Mellon is raking in almost $5 million a year in an abusive interest rate deal with the city of LA. Rather than keep our taxpayer money here to provide critical service to our community, Wall Street banks like Mellon are taking millions of our dollars straight out of town to New York. It's time for the Bank of New York Mellon and Dexia to renegotiate the rip-off interest rate deals that they have with LA. Like I've said before, Wall Street, it's bad enough you took Phil Jackson from us, but you definitely cannot have any more of our money. Fix our streets, don't fund Wall Street. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I don't know how I can sit here without a smile on my face with your closing. I urge, I'm Azar Nejad, I work with LADOT, and I'm an MOU 8, one of the Transportation Engineer Associates. I urge our LA City Mayor Garcetti and council members to launch a public inquiry into all Wall Street dealings with our LA City. Wall Street CEOs are up to their old tricks, and this time their old tricks is in our backyard. This is the time for all of us to hold Wall Street accountable for their act of price gouging our LA City through their excessive fee chargings. Wall Street crashed our nation's economy, and Wall Street took down our LA City in their crash process. Wall Street made our nation suffer then, and Wall Street is still continue making us all pay a price. Since Wall Street manufactured foreclosure crisis, our LA City taxpayers had to spend $1 billion in our LA City services for tending to tens of thousands of neglected bank-owned properties that blight our communities. Let us all just imagine if since 2008 we had available to our LA City that dollar amount to invest in our neighborhoods, the schools, the parks, the libraries, the clean streets for all LA City children. Let's just imagine some. And just last year...
Go ahead and finish the thought.
Oh, thank you.
Or two.
I do like the Imagine song too.
You're bringing us home. You're the cleanup hitter. So.
Let's imagine some. And just last year in 2013, Wall Street banks price gouged our LA City $300 million in excess fees charges alone. And this dollar amount is more than double of what our LA City spend on repairing potholes in our LA City streets. This is why our community groups, our taxpayers and our city workers, our clergy are coming together. We are all coming together to ask of our LA City elected leaders to stand up to Wall Street and to recover our resources that all of us need for our middle-class public sector jobs, to restore our critically and vitally needed neighborhood services. And now let's just act. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you to everyone who's come down to participate in this hearing. I think this is it's really been a good education for me. I've heard a lot about this issue, and I've read a lot about this issue, but it's starting now to gel. So thank you for all for helping me along those lines. Members, I'd like to propose that I'd like to suggest just a couple small amendments to the motion, Mr. Kretz. The one I already mentioned, referral to the city attorney to evaluate potential legal remedies that the city may have against these two lenders in particular, two parties in particular. I'd also like to add an instruction to the CAO. I think this is probably goes without saying, but and I think it already is done, but just for the sake of thoroughness, I'd like to also add an instruction to the CAO to continue to work with the Office of Finance on a continual basis to renegotiate and identify lower bank fees with all of our financial institutions. And then with regard to the second paragraph regarding terminating, the potential for terminating any current business. The only tweak I would ask of there, Mr. Kretz, is that we just take your language. I further move that if New York Mellon and Dexia are unwilling to renegotiate or terminate the swap deal at no cost to the city, that instead of just simply that we consider it, let's say that the CAO report back to Budget and Finance about the merits and risks of terminating any current business with these banks and excluding New York Mellon and Dexia from all future business with the city, so that this committee has the first bite at considering that, and then we would make an appropriate report to council based on whatever the state of the report is from the CAO.
I'm not sure exactly what you would mean by merits, because it's possible based on the CAO's reports that they would say there is no merit. This was a perfectly good deal. So how do we work around that in terms of the wording?
Well, then it's in our plate. It's on our plate. So they may say that. We may feel differently, but at least we have a report back about the status of the negotiations, what the appropriate risk or what the relevant risks and benefits are of potentially terminating business with those banks and excluding them. And then, eyes wide open, we can make a decision about whether we choose to recommend that to the City Council. I just think it would be, without having the benefit of knowing what happens in the negotiation and what other business there is and what that is, it wouldn't be giving the Council a full picture if we didn't have that and assess that in committee and then make that report.
All right, fair enough.
Mr. Blumenfield, anything further on this?
No, I'd like the parts about the risks and benefits, because that's the bigger question of what's at issue is we didn't know potentially didn't know all the risks and benefits. So
Exactly. So, all right, then with those amendments, I think it looks to be the unanimous view of this committee to advance the motion to council as amended. So, thank you all very much. And thank you, Mr. Kretz, for your leadership on this. Thank you. And with that, there's no other business before the committee. We are adjourned. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us and giving us
There's like I'm a lawyer too. David goes by